Well, welcome all the beautiful people there in Tone Town. We have the amazing Brian Wampler here with us today. I would say one of the Mount Rushmore, the people on Mount Rushmore as it comes to guitar pedal building. Certainly, one of the greats and has written a book. If you can find one, it's how much are they up to these days, Brian? It's like I remember one time I looked, they were like $1,000. There was one point they were like $1,000 for
at one point. So the modification book, which is something I wrote like 2007, it's pretty old. And at one point, like I just discontinued it.
Yeah,
there was just some out of date stuff and a lot of other reasons. And plus, I mean, your knowledge changes over time, right? So I stopped it, and then I saw prices were like $1,000, $1,500 for this book. And I'm like, oh my God, that's ridiculous. If you really want it that bad, like all I gotta do is press a button on Amazon and it's live again. So you can get it on Amazon. I just usually tell people, wait for, like, buy the course. That's a lot better than the book. Like that tells you a lot more about electronics than change C8 for more bass. Why?
Yeah.
I don't know. But I mean, everybody kind of starts somewhere, right? In 2007, I'd only been doing this for 6-7 years or something like that. So, go 20 years further, and I look at that book going, oh God, I would do things totally different now. Totally different.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty undisputable that sort of in I think the first wave of boutique guys, or I think we're kind of like the full tones and prescription electronics and those. But I think of the second wave of like, the Robert Keeleys and Analog Man. And I think you're right in there in that wave. And I think I think as far as developing the modifications of a lot of popular pedals, and then sort of taking that in the next step in converting it into pedals that you make and your own circuits and your own designs. It's been cool as a fan of the products to see the evolution, and I'm always very reverent of brands that have been able to continue to stay current decade over decade, because as both of us know, it can be a real revolving door of brands that of come in and come out. And when I look at Wampler or Keeley or even a brand I talk about a lot in terms of like maintaining sort of simplicity and a very similar aesthetic over a lot of years, is Exotic. Like they seem to they don't release a lot of stuff. They kind of like go for depth over breadth, and they've kind of been around and consistent for a long time. And I think that's really hard to do, is to be relevant in multiple decades, let alone one,
Right.
So I think you have a lot to be proud of in terms of the way that you've built your brand and continue to evolve. And I'm just so happy to have you here today. And with that in mind, I would like to talk to you first about, since you've seen, a lot of stuff go on. If you've been doing this since 2000, approximately, you've got to see a quarter of a century of stuff turning over. Where do you see?
You're old as hell, Brian.
But
he
look
didn't
great
say that in so many words. Okay.
When
Brian
someone's
looks
as
like $1
old
million
as
bucks.
you, Brian, I mean, what's it feel like? Golly.
I hope I look half as good as Brian. I don't even know how old you are, but I know you're a little older than me.
Half a century old, man. Golly.
But where do you see the pedal industry going in the next 5 to 10 years? Maybe we'll start with 5 and then go out to 10.
Sure.
I'm kind of curious.
I think we're in this. Well, if you asked me a year ago, I would say, man, people are not buying tube amps. They're moving towards modelers, like more widespread. People have always used modelers, but it seemed like it was becoming more widespread there, 2023, 2022 or so. And I mean, I was just seeing a lot of people selling amps just to buy the modelers, and then saying like, I don't want to mess with it anymore. Maybe it's too heavy. I don't want to deal with it. I don't, if I'm playing with headphones anyways, and so I don't really need the tube amp and the whole thing. And I guess more recently, I'm seeing sort of that changing, where it's like people are like, well, I don't want to get rid of my modeler, but I also want the tube amp. So I got to buy another tube amp. So it's like, it seems like people are kind of coming back to, these old electronics like we've been using for years and years and years. and still wanting the luxury and the modelers that you could just run headphones into and are going to sound great, right? I mean, years ago, like you had a pod. Yeah, that's what you plugged into, and it did the job, but it wasn't nearly as great as like plugging into a Fractal or Kemper or whatever neural DSP. But and then now you have companies like neural amp modeling, which is open source neural DSP basically. And so you have these websites where people are basically modeling everything they have. So, every amp, basically anything they can model, they're modeling and uploading for people to share. And now more people are making hardware that you can load these, they're called NAM modules, neural amp modeling, NAM. And I guess I see that side of things really becoming the new DIY movement, where guys like me and Josh Scott and everybody else, we kind of cut our teeth on like the DIY stomp boxes era and the Ampage era, where it's just forums and you're asking RG Keen and Jack Orman, how does this transistor work? and these, what I would call the true legends, the people behind the boutique movement who taught everybody everything.
Yeah.
Those guys are just, I'll never have the knowledge they have. They just, I would love to, I guess, not to change subjects, but I would love to sit down with each one of them and just completely pick their brain for hours and then just put it like in a series of YouTube videos or something. Kind of like what you do, Mason. That'd be great.
Yeah.
But anyways, the DIY movement with those guys, it really exploded. And then you have the JHS, you have the Earthquakers, you have us, and and of course, I'm sure that probably trickled down to you. You came, I guess, about 2010 or 11 or so, right? So I'm sure like that had some play in Vertex as well, surely somewhere.
Yeah.
But now that people are kind of getting into machine learning, some people kind of call it AI, but I guess you could. But it's more like the ability to create electronic circuits, all kinds of circuits, very easily just by profiling cool things.
Yeah.
And that world opening up completely. I don't know where that goes, but I think that gets even bigger, and I think it becomes more than just like neural amp modeling, the one open source thing. There's a couple different open source ways to do it, and I think more are going to come on the scene and make it even easier for people to do it. So it's pretty exciting. It's also scary because somewhere in the back of your mind you're thinking, am I going to have to look for a job in 10 years? So, so I mean, at the end of the day, I think the trick to all this is just taking care of the customers that you have as the best as you can, making the best things that you like. Hopefully others like them. And then there's always going to be those times where, you're like, I can make this cool amp or pedal or guitar or whatever. And, maybe it's a pickup. I can make these pickups exactly like they were in the 68 tellies or whatever. And people will dig those. I mean, I think those pockets will still exist as well. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I do wonder, like, is there an end of like the pedal industry as we know it? Is there an end of the tube amp industry as we know it? Does it become the harpist cord manufacturer? So
the thing that I think I love about this, though, hearing you talk about where you feel like the industry is going, I think from my perspective, what you said about serving customers well, and you didn't say this exactly, but creating community. I hear you talking about these profiles and amps, and I just think, man, this is awesome for the community of guitar players. They now have another thing to share, another thing to talk about. Like, I profiled it this way with these mics in this room. This is the result I got and why. And just another kind of area for people to really connect on. But for anyone listening that hasn't been on Brian's channels or socials, like you are such a great asset to creating community with your podcast and even just on Instagram. Like I look at you,
and probably the earliest guy to do it in our industry. I would say.
But you're giving away.
I don't feel I
secrets,
can live up to. I don't feel like I can live up to your words.
But I think from my perspective, you have. Like when I hear Wampler, the first thing that comes to mind, and this is absolutely genuine, first thing that comes to mind is like that guy loves what he does. That guy talks about circuits. You talk about how they manipulate. This is what went into this pedal when we were designing it, and you just seem to really enjoy it, and that is contagious. So for me, being an onlooker to what you do with Wampler, I just like it's something I want to be a part of. It's something I want to support because it's not just something that comes across as we're pushing this product out the door because we want to make more money and we're trying to do it as cheap as possible because profit is like, it just doesn't seem like that is your main driver.
No, I mean, if I was that way, we probably would be more successful and bigger, but I mean, ever since I've started, I've, in a weird way, it's like, I sort of sabotage myself, I'm learning how to, I'm starting this pedal company. I'm like, I'm going to write a book teaching others how to do this. That's a bad business idea. Even now, like teaching these courses, teaching people how to build guitar pedals. That's a bad idea from a business standpoint. That's a good way to put yourself out of business if you teach your competitors how to build them like you do. If you teach all your knowledge to someone, on paper, that's a bad idea. But to me, the more important thing is I'm going to die someday. And not that I know that much more than anyone else, but I figure I've learned little tricks along the way. It would be nice to pass that off to somebody who can benefit later down the road. And I don't think it's not a financial thing. It's more like a gut thing. Somewhere deep inside of me, the passion to do that is continuously burning. And I don't, like I said, it's if I wasn't that way, if I was just a person that counted the numbers and looked at everything and said, well, we can scrape off, half a cent by changing to this type of jack or whatever, we'd be a lot more profitable. But I think long-term, that's the wrong way to do things. I mean,
who knows?
At the end of the day, we're selling fun toys and tools to guitar players. Like this stuff is supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to be driven down to the cheapest bottom level.
I propose that we maybe figure out a way to create a product that puts your consciousness into one of these amp modelers, these neural amp modelers we're talking about, and you can just be with us forever, Brian. Do this. Why are you doing that with your gain? That was a dumb idea. Put the mic further away. Like you could, it could be a little sassy Brian.
There's several people that wouldn't like that. Definitely ex-wives wouldn't like that for sure. I mean,
he's like the Jiminy Cricket of tone,
I've got several haters on the internet that would not like that, I'm sure. So
well, don't we all? Don't we all?
Everybody's part of the gig, man.
Industry goes.
Part of the gig.
Industry goes.
But I think to your point about the DIY thing and it being a bad business move, I actually think it's a good. I'll tell you why I think it's a good business move, because the number of people that you reach, the percentage of them that are actually going to transform your DIY skill that you teach them into a career is a very low percentage. But I think what you've done to everybody else is you sort of disarmed anybody who is saying anything about the price of things or that you are not offering any reciprocity to the people that buy your stuff. If somebody says, well, I don't like that this pedal's $199, it's not worth it. And you say, great, I have this free tutorial, or I've showed you this thing that you can do yourself, and you don't have to pay anything for it. This is free information for you, and so it's difficult for somebody to attack somebody on that when you've provided the very skill set yourself to them in your very same methodology. It doesn't get any more democratic than that, and so I think it's a really great thing, and I've certainly learned a ton from seeing what people like you have done, and again Robert Keeley, and then going back like R.G. Keene, Jack Orman, Craig Anderton, like all these guys were really instrumental in a lot of industry. Like I remember reading somebody saying that Robert Bradshaw, he said he couldn't have done his original switchers without Craig Anderton. Like he was, using, technology that he was talking about in magazines to create those early switching systems.
Right.
And so it's all far reaching, there's all this stuff. And I think it segues into another question that I love your take on is there such thing as original circuits anymore as it relates to like I think specifically analog overdrives and distortion devices? Like, is there a way to really create a fully original design, or are we pretty much there's only so many ways we can create distortion? Right. Most of them have already been done. Where do you kind of settle on this?
I think there's two different ways of looking at it. One is a very generic way, like, okay, we're using op amps and transistors and diodes the way they were meant to be used, right? So, I always get cracked up. I think it's the electroharmonics. What's that trouble? The transistor boost they had, the LPB1, I think.
Right.
And everyone, like, if you see a transistor circuit, someone's like, that's the LPB1. And I'm like, no, that's the data sheet. When you look at the data sheet, that's what it looks like. They made a product called the LPB1, though, that had some changes, but still is just doing what it's meant to do, man. You're using a transistor to boost the voltage like it tells you how to do in the data sheet. So from that standpoint, like, you're not really going to make a transistor, you're not going to turn it into a delay, for example, not just with that transistor. But I think there's different ways of looking at a circuit. Like, we could take like the tube screamer that everyone knows, and you can say, okay, well, all these 1,000 pedals are all basically exact clones of the TS9 or TS808. But then you have Earthquaker, who did the plumes, which still, if you look at it from a distance and don't look at part values, like, it's just a tube screamer. You play it, you're like, that sounds nothing like a tube screamer. Mm-hmm. And it's because Jamie literally changed everything and just kept the topology. Now, so from my perspective, I'm like, that's no longer a tube screamer. It doesn't sound anything like it. It wasn't meant to sound anything like it. It's a unique thing that just uses some circuit blocks that are common circuit blocks. Mm-hmm. So that's why I said, like, I kind of look at it two different ways.
Yeah.
And sort of this, like, I think fuzzes are hard because you get a couple different flavors of fuzz, and everyone kind of seems to stick pretty much like your fuzz face and your tone bender and your couple different big muffs, and people don't get that far apart from that. They don't get that far away from it, rather. And from my experience, you kind of have to, because at least in my experience, this may not be for you or anyone else, but whenever we've done something different, like the Leviathan we did, it was a fuzz, not based on anything. And like, the number one question I got was, is it a fuzz face? No. Was it a big muff? No. Was it a tone bender? No. Well, do you make anything like that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't want to make anything like that. Go buy
that's
the
a frustrating
big muff,
question.
But I hear what you're saying, that we get punished for deviating too far, from what people like. Yeah.
So I mean, like, there's this line, like, it's cool and different enough that still is something I can identify with. And I think like the Tube Screamer and probably the Claw now are like the new versions of, if they don't sound something like that, they're probably not going to be a massive overdrive. Yeah. At least to those who, I would say outside of the gear groups, because the people in the gear groups and forums and stuff like that tend to be people that just, they know, more about pedals than the average guitar player ever thought about pedals, like they live, breathe, sleep, eat guitar pedals. Yeah. And a lot of guitarists just don't do that. They go to their Guitar Center or whatever, and they play through a couple things like, that sounds cool. That I'll take that pedal. Who's the Kelly Electronics? Who's that? Never heard of them, but that's fine. And that's the typical guitar player, right? Yeah. Or the Wampler. Yeah. What's a Wampler anyway?
Wampler.
And that's the typical. They're not knocking on people, but most people are like, they want to play guitar, and the pedal is the tool to get them to play guitar. They buy it because they're like, that's cool. I can go home and sound like John Mayer or whatever. And I think that's the typical guitar player that outside of gear groups, it doesn't really, it's like a whole different type of customer demographic. I would say in those gear groups, that's where people really, like, they know the difference when they hear one tube screamer versus another. Like, oh, I can totally hear a difference because there's, at 120 hertz, there's like half a dB difference in this one versus this other one. Whether that's true or not, but I mean, that's like people are that much into it that they want those little differences that the average guitar player going to a store will probably never hear or care about. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Mason, but I just generally ramble. That's kind of, I know. That's how my head works. So.
I think that there's something to be said about that. I think that I agree with you that there can be a tendency to be very reductive about any circuit that people see, and they're also, by the same token, if there is somebody who is a little bit of an authority on something like this, it's very easy for them to influence other people where they kind of become repeaters, where it's like, well, I saw once that somebody said, well, this is just a blank pedal. So now whenever this comes up, I'm going to go into the Rolodex of knowledge that I have when this circuit is invoked, and I'm going to post, but it's just a blank. Even though I don't know what a blank is, I'm just going to say that because somebody who I think knows more than I do.
It's hard not to say something. It's hard to say not to say something when someone's like, I love this blues breaker, but this is the same thing as a blues driver. It's the same thing. You're like, no. Two completely different types of circuits. But the names are so similar that it confuses people. And so therefore, like you said, somebody talks about it somewhere else and that gets kind of taken as the truth. And it just misinformation that's not intentionally misinformation. You know what I mean?
No.
So
no, I don't think it's intentional, but I think that there definitely is I think that it's probably partial people trying to be helpful. And I think on other times it's maybe gatekeeping, or something like
Could
that. But that's why it's such an interesting place. The forums, they have this this blessing and a curse element. They can make a lot of brands and they can break a lot of brands.
That is very true. Yeah. And some other brands, they don't even matter. I remember it was years ago and ZVEX was saying something like the sales from the gear page at that time was massive, way before Facebook. And he's like, my sales don't come from the gear page. Like no one could talk about my pedals and I would still make a good living because people would go to the stores and buy them. Kind of going back to my different customer mentality thing, right? Like, so the typical pedal base doesn't necessarily live in their gear group or the gear forum, but those type of people, there's such a depth of knowledge as far as like what a consumer likes and doesn't like about guitar gear. Like just reading through the forums, I find it's so fascinating just to see how the use of their of guitar pedals changes over time and what people like, how that changes over time just by looking and reading how people are perceiving new pedals coming out. You know what I mean? So it's a fascinating dive into data that if ChatGPT ever does become fairly accurate in this sort of thing, it's probably going to make someone very wealthy. So just ask the right prompt and be like, oh, here's the next 10 pedals from my pedal line based on the data.
Yeah. I think that's probably not far off because I think, I think that there are certainly trends I'm sure that you see and that I see where it is a fairly, at least in the, again, speaking just to analog distortion and overdrive, it's kind of a core group of circuits that are sort of just recapitulated in different formats or in dual pedals or, dual pedals with switchable orders and stuff like that. And of course, this, I don't want to do the reductive thing that a lot of people do online where they say it's just a this. And I can appreciate something like the plumes. It's like, you know, if the tube screamer is a cut of beef, if it's a T-bone, every manufacturer has their preparation. One guy's a sous vide, and the other guy is a pan fry, and the other guy's a barbecue, and the other whatever it is, and they all have their preparations, and the outcome means that it is different, even though it's starting with this core thing, and it can sound way different, and they can taste way different. You know, it's the preparation of the steak. So I kind of think of it in those sorts of terms, but I also think at the same time it's very easy to just be like, well, they're just cooking T-bones. You know, you just get anyone, it's fine. You know, and that's say that Sizzler is the same as Ruth Chris, and it's just not. You know. So that's my agreement on that. But I want to continue the conversation. But before I do, I want to mention two sponsors that make our podcast possible every single week. The first of which are our friends over at the Guitar Sanctuary, and they just so happen to carry Wampler pedals. So if you're interested in potentially any Wampler pedal, I'm a big fan of the Tumnus. I have the mini one that I'm using on one of my mini rigs at this very moment as my Klon sound. I know Grant is also a fan of the Tumnus. I also have a Corey Wong compressor, I should just say that, full disclosure, and I also have an Ego Comp, which I guess was what birthed the Corey Wong compressor. Yep. And they are devices that I use all the time, and you can get those over at the Guitar Sanctuary, guitarsanctuary.com. You can peruse their website, all sorts of things, whether you're interested in guitars, amplifiers, pedals, etc. They have it all. Secondly, I like to talk about our friends over at Neural DSP and let you know about their brand new software, the Chorus 3.0. And they've introduced two of their plugins that are now available to migrate from your desktop or laptop now onto your Quad Cortex, and they're going to slowly be releasing more and more and more. Right now, they have the Plenty plugin in addition to the Gojira X version, and so you can have all the different amp models that are a part of that particular plugin now available again on your Quad Cortex. And each month or so, there's going to be more rolling out, so you'll be able to eventually have their entire suite available to you, which is great if you're somebody like me that already has a bunch of their plugins and wants to use those and migrate those onto your Quad Cortex. And I know that I am primarily a real tube amp user, but I'll say one condition where I found the Quad Cortex to be very useful is we did an interview with Seal, and I was forced to play guitar with Seal, by Seal. And it was great for overdubbing purposes by way of using the Quad Cortex, because in order to correct some of the clams that I played, I didn't have to worry about going back into the studio, miking up the amp the exact same way, getting the pedal settings in the exact same place. I had a saved preset. I could go and make those overdubs at home, and it sounds exactly the same that it did in the studio. So that was one place where I did find the Quad Cortex quite useful in terms of a sort of post-production tool to match exactly what I had done sound-wise in the original session. So, Neural DSP saves the day in that case. So just wanted to give them that shout out.
Nice.
Right. Awesome.
All right. So we're talking about original circuits and whether those exist. I want to now move on to underappreciated circuits that you think you really like and you just don't see them kind of taking or kind of getting any traction in the gear community. And also I'm curious about pedal brands that you feel like are really great and maybe never got their due or reached the sort of the commercial success that you think that they deserved. Any thoughts on those two topics, Brian?
I know as soon as I say something, I'm going to, we'll stop recording, and tomorrow morning I'll be like, should have mentioned them,
Yeah. So this won't be an exhaustive list. This will just be a list of whatever's on the top of your head right now.
So first question was underappreciated circuits, right?
Yeah.
I always think it's like weird with appreciated circuits. So like, let's take the distortion, for example.
Yeah.
From Ibanez. We just released, what did I call it? A Mofetta.
Yeah.
And which is kind of based around that. And when the distortion came out, it was just an average old overdrive, nothing special. Nobody really cared that much. It was fine, but it wasn't like no one was amazed by it. And it wasn't really until it's like just the right people get their hands on it, the right people that have the right amount of influence, I guess you could say, for kind of a yucky word, but influence in the guitar community. And when people see them playing it, they're like, oh, well, I have to have one. You know, that will make me sound like Tom Bukovac now, you know, or whatever. And the truth is, like, it doesn't matter what pedal you buy. Like, you literally could just buy the junkiest, cheapest thing you could find. And if you're Brent Mason or Tom Bukovac, you're going to make it sound better than anyone else. You know, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what amp, doesn't matter what guitar. It does a little bit, but sound-wise, like, a good player is going to make that thing sound good no matter what it is. So I kind of approach it more like, what are the circuits that I play that, one, more from an engineering perspective, like, oh, that's a cool way to mix up those circuit blocks. It's kind of like what we said. There's nothing new under the sun in analog. It's just different ways of mixing and matching stuff. But so some of the Ibanez, like the 5 series and the little plastic box and even the 7 series, from that viewpoint, I like some of those circuits just because different ways of doing old things. But then there's other pedals that I'm trying to think of something that really has struck me. Probably, I don't even think it's new, really. The Visual Sound, Jekyll and Hyde.
Yeah,
the old one, the gray one, the
one that looked like a home plate.
The whole big home plate ones, the right channel, based on the Marshall Shredmaster, but had some different tricks. And I think RG Keen helped with that, actually.
Yeah, I think he helped with a bunch of their stuff, didn't he? He was like, I think so.
Yeah. But that right channel was it was a great sounding distortion, especially for 2005 or whenever that came out, 2003. And that was, I mean, of course, that was popular, but it kind of, like with everything else, it's got a shelf life. And at some point, that will just fall out of favor and something new will pop up in the spotlight and people will love that. And it'll be the best thing since forever. And I think this is probably bad to say, but I think it just kind of boils down to consumerism, where people are like, I got to have the new thing. Got to have the new thing. I've had this. I'm tired of this. I've been playing this same old Overdrive for 6 months now, and I got to have the new thing. And luckily that happens for people like you and I, Mason, because that allows us not to have to get a real job, right? So that is the good part, that we don't have to go get a real job and like wear a suit and tie and stuff like that. That'd be terrible. I have to get up early in the morning. That sucks. So, I mean, like, that is the good side, but I on one hand, I wish that there was more of a general knowledge about circuits where people would say, well, I mean, I like this pedal, but it's really based on something I already got, so I don't really need it. You know, I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's a little naive. I think there is something to be said for just picking up any sort of gear, whether it's a pedal or guitar or whatever, plug it into a different amp, and you just play something different. For whatever reason, something different comes out of your fingertips onto the guitar, and you're like, that's the cool song idea. I need to do something with that. And like that little hint of inspiration, wherever that comes from, I have no idea. Maybe it is the gear, maybe it's just, the universe. But I think for those, like, that's the coolest thing to me, is more than like, what's the best circuit right now that's underappreciated, which I appreciate the question, but like, to me as a player, it's more about what's the circuit that whenever I plugged into, for whatever reason, something just happened and I had some sort of little bit of inspiration that wasn't there before. Mm-hmm. And I've never been able to put my finger on what that is. So it's a hard question to answer.
So for you right now, you have a whole bunch, for those people listening only and not seeing video, Brian is in front of some awesome gear. I can't see all the individual pedals behind you, but presumably...
there's a bunch.
Presumably there's some Wamplers in there as well.
There's some Wamplers.
What are you grabbing? You have a guitar, you have that Marshall half stack behind you. What one Overdrive pedal are you going to grab to hopefully get that inspiration or that new take, that new approach that you're just kind of talking about here that is kind of hard to put your finger on?
A little sacrilegious, but it's usually a new amp.
Oh,
It's usually a new amp.
So it's usually not even a pedal that you're putting in between guitar and amp. It's just
Generally
the amp
not.
itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a company called Crab Amps, for example, built out of Ukraine. Found it like on Reverb for like $700 or something. And it was based around an old Mesa Mark, maybe 2 or 3. I forget what series now. But it's not an exact clone. But I picked it up, plugged into it, and I was like, holy my God, this thing is great. And that made me start looking at different distortion circuits. Like, how do I put that into a pedal? How do I get that chewiness aspect that this amp is doing into a pedal? So that's kind of how I'm approaching it, rather than like, what's the circuit block I need to use? The inspiration usually comes from playing, and like I said, I'm an old dude. So it's usually sort of classic rocky based, or maybe 90s or early 2000s rock, but something a little bit older that I just plug into, and it gives me the warm and fuzzies. And I'm like, how do I put that magic into a box, into a little 9-volt box? Yeah. That's probably why. I mean, a lot of people think we do a lot of amp in the box stuff, and it's not really intentional. Well, not always. It's not like I'm always trying to go for that. It's just that's where the inspiration usually draws from. And there's exceptions, of course. So like I've played great fuzzes, and I'm like, that's a great sounding fuzz that I wish I could get that sound at a low volume without a cranked amp. Like that's a desire. So there's other situations where that doesn't apply. But for the most part, in a perfect world, every guitar amp there'd be no need for dirt pedals, because there'd be so many tube amps that were affordable and unlimited room and no noise.
Yeah, housing prices are going to have to go down too.
Exactly. You just have rooms of amps, and you can just plug into each one for your pedals, right? Just a big MIDI switcher. But that's a little hard to fit, in a spare room usually.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. I was going to ask you one thing, if it's all right with the Tumnus, again being a pedal that for years I have really enjoyed. Off the back of what you were saying earlier about their consumerism being a double-edged sword in the industry, it's great to keep new ideas going and let's be honest, funding those new ideas, because you need to sell the old stuff to have profit to make new stuff. But the Tumnus, in my mind, is something I've said on this channel before. It has a ton, at least from an outside perspective, a ton of staying power. You did the Tumnus, you've done variations of it over the years, but the Tumnus name, in my mind, I think of a great Klon-inspired pedal. And one that has stuck around for years and years, one that I have been able to recommend for years and years when people want that sound without paying $5, $8, whatever they're up to now, $1,000 for a real Klon.
It's more for a Klon than it is a car at this point, I think.
Yeah, exactly. What is it, do you think, about that? I mean, there's 1,000,001, I don't want to say clone.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's offensive, but Klon-inspired pedals.
No, I mean, you're exactly right. That's in... Like, Klon is the new tube screamer for whatever reason. Everyone's making a clone version of it, including us. In fact, that's one of the things I said I'd never do. For years, I'm like, I'm not doing a clone of that circuit. And the only reason was probably my ego, if I'm being honest. And what I needed to do, I needed to stop like listening to my head going, well, I could design myself better than that. Rather than that, I needed to say, what are my customers asking me for? Yeah. And everyone was asking me to put out something like that. And once I did, I mean, it's done well for us for sure. But I will say it's kind of like having a hit with a cover song if you're a musician. You love it. It's great.
It's a good analogy.
But I didn't design it. That's Bill Finnegan's,
Yeah.
Yep.
We just made it convenient and less expensive. And of course, and smaller, and you try to make it better, right? So you try to filter the power a little better. You try to lay it out in a way that it's going to be the least amount of noise, like stuff like that. But if you change it too far, it's no longer a Klon, kind of like the Plumes. Right. Not that it won't be good, but if it's changed too far, it's no longer the clone that people are wanting to buy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's a solid pedal. I like it. Which I'll ask you one more question about it, which we've talked about on this channel before as well, and other pedals and referring to other things. The Tumnus Mini versus the Tumnus, let's say normal or full size.
Sure, yeah. The Deluxe.
The Deluxe, yeah.
Is there, if someone was to do a blindfolded A/B test, same settings, are they going to notice a huge difference strictly based on the criteria of the size of the pedal?
So the Deluxe is one of those things that, looking back, I say, I wish I would have done differently. And it's not that it's inferior. It's just that from a design perspective, I've moved on from where I was in 2017 or 16, 15, whenever that was. 15? Golly, it's getting a long time. So what it basically is a clone into an EQ pedal.
Okay.
That's it. There's really no other changes. Now the EQ is running that full 27 volt spread, so it's still running, plus 18 minus, what's it, 8 or whatever it was. I forget what it is. So it's still running the higher voltage for the headroom because you're shoving a ton of signal through it. But other than that, it's just an active bass and an active mid. So just like on a graphic EQ, if you set them to minimum or in the middle, well, then that's neutral. So that's your neutral point. Bass and mids at noonish, because potentiometers have variability, right? Like there's a tolerance to everything. So on one pedal, it might be 1130. On another pedal, it might be 1230 or whatever. But still around noonish, and then that treble control is just the same old control like you'd find on the Klon.
Mm.
But other than that, the size of the pedal isn't making a huge... that old debate of mini pedals sound worse than their full-size equivalents.
Same stuff. Same electronics. It's real. I mean, and I do the same thing. In fact, I did it on a Sedano video. I was absolutely convinced that a bright switch changed the sound of that. I think it was the clean channel maybe or something. I could have swore it did. And I made the video, put it out, and then one of the guys that works at Sedano sent me this schematic. He's like, that switch doesn't touch that. I was like, whoops. But I tricked myself. I wanted to believe that so bad that I tricked myself into hearing it. You know? So we all do it.
Well, it's all fun. It's very funny how people with pedals, guitars, amps, whatever it is, people will hear with their eyes first, right? You show them the real clone. This is what it's sounding like, and then you show them a clone. This is what it sounds like. And 9 times out of 10, the real clone sounds better than the original. And it doesn't matter what the audio clips are. It matters what you show them.
There was some precedents, though, I think, that kind of poisoned the well. I think in the early days of the transitions from like large pedals into mini pedals of the same pedal, that there were some bad implementations. Like I can remember some in particular... And this isn't to single out any particular brand, but my presumption is that they had a super high impedance circuit that was very sensitive to layout, and then they moved everything in this tiny space, and then the result was much different because of the nature of the circuit, and now everything is really close to each other, and then they're like, well, there's a sound difference. So, we stopped doing MIDI pedals because MIDI pedals changed the sound. And it was really, it wasn't a method thing, it was an implementation thing. But I remember there was a lot of people that proliferated that messaging because either their individual experience with it was poor, comparing their full size to a mini, or a manufacturer had said, well, we tried it and it doesn't work. Or something like that.
Yeah.
And it can start these wildfires, on online. And again, I think that the average consumer doesn't know what to believe, but even, just sort of casting doubt is enough to make people think twice about it.
Yeah. We had something similar with, we have a pedal called the Bell, which is based on like a Noble's ODR1 thing. And, the big complaint among like all the ODR clones are that they sound too hi-fi. And when you look back at it, you're like, well, that's because it's a shitty bypass on the old Nobles.
Yeah.
I mean, like, so that's how do we build nothing? I don't mean that disrespectfully towards Nobles. Like, it was an inexpensive pedal, and they used a chip.
Just the FET. Was it FET for the bypass on that?
I forget now, man. I forget. It was an old, like an IC, little switching IC, but it didn't do it. Like, it just didn't do a very good job of the switching, of the electronic switching. Yeah. And part of that, like, drag on the circuit itself kind of made it nice and warm. Yeah. So we actually had to design that into the pedal. And when laying out, like, okay, so how do we kind of arrange this in a way where it's not going to sound, from an engineering perspective, proper? Like, we have to make sure we have to build in some of these improper sounds, right? So it definitely is something you have to take account into, and even really, I mean, and you alluded to it, Mason, which is you can take a circuit that has what would consider to be a bad layout, and whenever you lay it out properly, it can sound different for sure. Yeah. So I mean, that I would say that stuff makes a lot more difference, more than like, what type of capacitors are you using in the as coupling caps or something like that. Like, I don't put that much. I mean, there's reasons for using certain capacitors, but an example would be I'm probably never going to put a silver mica through-hole cap in a pedal just because it has like some magical quality, right? But I will use certain caps that aren't microphonic in a certain position, because they're not microphonic or they don't have a lot of ESR or something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, there's reasons, basically resistance that signal kind of the caps leak, basically. So, I mean, there's things like that you take into account, but I don't know. I think if you take the same exact Klon circuit, for example, that's laid out like Bill laid it out, and you take one that's on, let's say it's surface mount, and it's properly laid out, I would say those two are going to sound different. And the trick is, well, what do I need to do to the surface mount one to make it sound like the old one? Like, if it's due to, like you said, the layout and the sensitivities of the input impedance, well, then how do I build that into this small little surface mount pedal? So it's stuff like that where you start going way off into the weeds, and it's when I get to that point, that's when I start talking to the engineers that work with us. I'm like, okay, here's what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do. What do I need to do here? To get to what I want, because that's just that is not my skill set. Is that part of it at all?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not even any two clones sound the same. I think sometimes the leakage in those germanium diodes and stuff like that are more responsible for sound differences between them than maybe people will acknowledge. But it's funny that you say that about that Nobles, because before XTS Exactone was in Nashville, I was building Tom Bukovac a lot of pedal boards, and one of the things he had me do, and now Exactone does a much better job than I ever did of this, but I would rehouse the Nobles, and I'd put a 3-pole double throw foot switch on it. And I remember when I modded the first one for him and I sent it to him, he said it sounded different. And I was like, well, how can it sound different? Like, everything about this is literally the same. And the only difference is that I decided to bypass their switching system to make it a more direct signal path, between the input and output. And he's like, no, it sounds different. So I was like, well, send it back. And then I racked my brain. I was like, okay, this is the only thing that's different. So, okay, we're going to build the bypass around the existing switch.
Just set it so it's on, right?
Yeah. And he's like, that's it, And I was like, this is hysterical, And this was like 15 years ago or 12 years ago or something like that. And so, it's funny that you say that, because the built-in crappiness and inefficiency is a sound. And people like that,
People get used to it. They love it. I had a very similar thing happen with Johnny Hiland years ago. And guys like him and Tom, like, they have such great hearing. They hear every little tiny difference in audio. It's a fascinating thing. But I forget, it was something really crazy. Like, I put it in a different type of enclosure, a different brand or something. And for whatever reason, like he could just tell the difference. He could hear the difference between like one enclosure versus another. I think that's what it was. It's been a while back, but it was something very minor.
So was it? Do you think it had to do with just the shielding of it being like steel versus aluminum or something like that?
Just
had
the
some
component,
sort of EMF issue that happened.
That's the only thing I can think of. But I mean, and Johnny can't see very well, anyways.
Yeah.
So like you can set it far enough where he can't see it, and he'll tell you the difference.
Wow,
and he's like, he's got this tiny little high end difference in it. Like, how in the world do you hear that, Johnny?
Yeah.
Just got fantastic ears, man.
So what do you do in that instance where you're trying to help a customer who's hearing things that, let's say, to make an extreme example of your story just now, who's hearing things that you can't hear? How do you bring that back to your shop and try and fix a problem that you can't necessarily identify easily?
I've had that with Brent Mason a lot, because he's another guy that has great hearing. And it's just a lot of notes. I'm like, tell me exactly what you're hearing. And he'll be like, I think it's about 1.7K. Like,
no way.
Yeah, he's like, just bump it up just a little bit. I'm hearing something a little different when the tone control is right here. It's like this 1.7, maybe 1.8K. And you're like, how are you? Oh my God, how are you hearing this? So, I mean, but that's what they do day in and day out, right?
Yeah.
So that's one of their tools is their ears. And, when that becomes your main tool, then you can hear things that other people will swear don't exist.
Crazy. I want to continue on with this. I'm going to stop here really quick to tell you guys about two of our sponsors that make the podcast possible. The first one is Mono Creators, which you guys can find at monocreators.com. Specifically, I want to tell you guys about their power supplies. They have a low profile, narrow power supply that I love because it slots in underneath angled pedal boards in just about any space you can find for it. They are very low profile, lightweight, fully isolated, and a great quality supply. Of course, you've heard us probably ad nauseum now talk about how much we love their soft bags, whether they're guitar bags or pedal board bags. Mono does some great quality gear that lasts for years and years after you purchase it. So definitely something to check out. Go to monocreators.com, use the code CHAIRMEN, CHAIRMEN, if you want to save 10% or 90% away from free. Also want to tell you guys about BTPA or Bestronix. We all have a little bit of a Brad crush going on. Brad over at BTPA helps us out with all of our part numbers for pedalboard builds, whether it's jacks, cable, dual lock, anything that you need for your pedalboard build. I always go to him actually with different types of D sockets that I need, locking jacks or XLRs, whatever it may be, USB throughs for programming and updating pedals. It's all at Bestronix. And again, you can use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off at btpa.com. Ask for Brad, tell him the chairman sent you. Mason, I'll throw it back to you.
Well, Brian, I want to be respectful of your time and ask you one final question before we complete today. And the question is, and I'm just trying to remember here, on Mount Rushmore, there's 4 heads, right? I think that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So if we were to ask the great Brian Wampler, what are the Mount Rushmore overdrive pedals for you? What are going to go on there on Tone Mountain?
You know what? Again, as soon as we get done recording, my answer will probably change. But let me think for a second.
You can say 4 Wampler pedals if you want to.
Yeah.
the Tumnus Deluxe. No, I mean, so I'm going to go very generalized. So if I say Marshall Blues Breaker, that means all the iterations, including the governor, the shred master, everything that's non-inverting op amp into inverting op amp. So like that whole Marshall stuff, Blues Breaker, shred master type thing.
Do you know who designed those, by the way?
I don't, I don't. But I'll admittedly, like, I am the polar opposite of Josh Scott. I know nothing about history in the guitar world at all. Like, I'm terrible at it.
Yeah.
But sure he'll probably do a video on it sometime. So we got the Marshall stuff. I mean, you have to throw the Tube Screamer and the Klon up there now. So like, you just have to. And then the other one, golly, let's say, I'm hesitant to say Box of Rock, maybe, just because it's just, it's, yeah, just because it's at that time. I mean, that was like multiple gain stages doing what, like what you would do with tubes, and it wowed me as a young man.
In a small form factor too. One of the smaller dual overdrive pedals out there.
And it had a boost on it too, right? You had the super hard on channel also on there too.
Yep. Yep.
And then it had the DC on the pot, which confused a bunch of people.
Right? Yeah, the Scratch OK or whatever it's called.
Yep.
Well, it didn't originally have the Crackle OK originally. I think that they added that later because people were like, "Man, my pot's like dirty." I move it and it's
Yeah, that's what happens when you move that DC around.
Yeah.
So I mean,
kind of forget.
Again, it's probably one of those things like I have to make a correction tomorrow and then the next day because I'll think of something else. But definitely Tube Screamer, definitely Klon, and yeah, I guess that's probably where my brain is right now.
I used to rehouse a lot of those Box of Rocks because a lot of the session guys said that the knobs were too close to the foot switches, and so they wanted to like put them into like a 1590 BB to make it deeper so that they could have more separation. Because whenever they'd go for the foot switch, they'd like move the the special setting. And so I can't tell you, I probably rehoused 20 of them for like Nashville guys because I did one for Bukovac, and then like all the other guys then like oh, let's move them back, Luckily that was an easy one. Just the layout of it was super simple to do that too. I can't imagine like if somebody had come to you and said, "Hey, rehouse a Jekyll and Hyde for me." Imagine how many times you'd have to cut that PCB to get it to fit into a normal enclosure.
Can you find an enclosure that big?
I mean, I think you'd have to cut it. You'd have to cut it probably, and you'd probably have to use some sort of standoffs or something like that is how I would imagine.
That enclosure drove me crazy.
They did sound really good, though. I have to say, visual sound, I feel like is underrated, especially that older stuff. That H2O chorus, really good chorus. It's a really good chorus. It just was not that attractive. But I think RG Keen was involved in a lot of those. I'm pretty sure.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. And I remember back when I was getting started, Bob. Wow, right? Yeah, Bob.
Yep.
He invited me out to his house and literally just let me pick his brain for a couple hours. So, and I was just getting started. And I thought that was really, really cool of him. Just, even though we were in the same industry and he knew that I was trying to build a pedal company, he's like, dude, I've done a lot of things. Ask me what you need to know,
Yeah.
So cool.
So that was really cool of him to allow me to do that. But one of the things he told me, one of the things I asked, I said, what was like, if you pointed to one thing that this is what elevated me to be successful, he's like, the weird shape of the pedal. It absolutely stood out. In a pedal counter at a store, it stood out among everything.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, he definitely did that. He definitely did that. He also had these. Do you remember this video, this final thing, Brian? You remember this video that he did a long time ago? It's probably almost 20 years now. It was like real early days of YouTube, where he did, I think it was at like a Nashville NAMM show, where he did like listening tests.
Like the op-amp challenge or something, right?
Yeah, and he had all these people in the room, and that were guitar players presumably, and he would have something like behind a curtain, and he would, and he did it for like multiple things. I think he did op-amps for sure, but I know that there was like multiple different things in there that he did, trying to sort of dispel mythology, about pedals. And I thought it was like a really interesting video. I don't know if it's still, in the bowels of YouTube somewhere, but
I mean, I don't even know. I know they're now True Tone. I don't know if like the visual sound channel, is that even still up? I don't know.
I don't know.
I do remember those videos.
They were fascinating.
They were. Had that happened today, like people there would have been like mass fighting in the streets.
Yeah. Now it's
all
all
the Redditors against
Tonewoods.
all the TGPers, you know?
Yeah, it's the Tonewood people are now doing it. It's shifted. I love
Again,
that.
this is supposed to be fun. We're not supposed to fight over this stuff.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be excited to see, Brian, when you transition all your guitars to acrylic, since the Tonewoods don't matter.
There we go.
Jim Lill told me, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I don't even know if he knew like what the consequences of that would be, but God bless him.
He did.
That was a great video.
He did not think it was going to do that. He's a sweet guy. I don't know if you know him or not. He's a really good guy.
I don't, but I have a lot of respect for his videos. I think he had to have spent, I mean, you and I know this because of the amount of videos that we're making. That had to take like so long to edit, so long to shoot, like really, really in detail. Like it was not easy. Can
you imagine working on like 9 months on one video?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I can't imagine.
9 days on one video would be challenging.
9 days on one video is too much. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Brian, I can't thank you enough for being here, and I'm again, I can't reiterate enough how grateful I am that you're here in the industry and all the contributions that you've made in your wonderful circuits. And we'll of course have all of the credentials for your website and socials and all that stuff available. Sure. And I highly recommend people check out a cool series that I really like that Brian does is what makes it's the circuit great. Do I have it right?
That's right. Yeah, I wonder if I should keep going with that, because some people got really mad that I was kind of like making fun of Rick Beato, and I'm like, I'm not. I already told Rick I was doing it. Like, I'm not making fun of him. I don't think it has anything to do with that. Yeah, I mean, I think that it wasn't like it was a turn of phrase that didn't exist before Rick Beato either. Right, exactly.
So I just think it's really interesting, because I think in the way that Josh Scott unpacks sort of the historical context for pedals, this is sort of like a circuit breakdown that gives some really interesting information that I think, again, is distilled for a regular person. Like, you don't have to be technical to appreciate this. And that's really hard to do, to synthesize complicated information where regular people will understand it.
Right.
And so I think it's a really fun thing. And it gets you some knowledge about some of these circuits. And I think maybe it could be good if you're a person on the forums, gives you some distinctions to kind of work from, to sort of parse the fire hose of water that's just coming at us, with information.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thank you, Brian, for all that. And hopefully we'll have you on again at some point in the future.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, absolutely, man.
All right. Well, until next time. We'll see you guys.
Thanks, guys.